How are we doing? So this video is all about an event that was seen as instrumental in the Black Civil Rights Movement in the UK, and in particular the role that one man had to play in changing the lives of black people across the country. Now quickly, before I get going, please make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really does wonders for small channels like mine that are just getting off the ground. But without further ado, let's get into Paul Stephenson and the Bristol Bus Boycotts. There was probably around about 3,000 people of West Indian origin settled in Bristol during the early 1960s, and they were largely confined to a single area of the city, namely St Paul's. Not only did they face general social discrimination in terms of housing and employment, but they were also the subject of frequent racist attacks from local youths. Guy Bailey, who I'll talk about more later in the video, was raised in Jamaica and moved to Bristol in 1961. He recalls his own experiences being attacked by gangs of teddy boys as he was chased and hit with bicycle chains. He said, "Bristol was a very cold city, both in terms of the weather and the people." An example of the employment discrimination black residents suffered was from the Bristol Omnibus Company, which is of course the focus of this video. They had what was known as a colour bar policy in place, which meant that they refused to hire anyone of black or Asian descent. Now remember, discrimination of this kind was not actually illegal in the UK at the time. It may have been something that people could have contested on a moral level, but there was absolutely nothing in the law preventing these kinds of policies from being enforced. In fact, the Bristol Omnibus Company since 1950 was a nationalised company, meaning it was at this time state-owned under the control of the British Transport Commission. So you could argue that the policies it had in place were just a reflection of what was going on much higher up. There was already an action group in place to fight against racial discrimination in the UK, but there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the job that they were doing. So 4 young West Indian men came together to organise a new movement. These men were Roy Hackett, Owen Henry, Audley Evans and Prince Brown, and their group would later go on to be known as the West Indian Development Council. They decided to elect Paul Stephenson as their spokesperson, as his level of education was of a much higher standard and his manner of speaking was articulate and powerful. And this is ultimately the story of how the Bristol Bus Boycott came about. Now, the colour bar policy wasn't an official part of the operations for the Bristol Omnibus Company, but Stevenson had a plan to test it. He organised a job interview for a vacant bus conductor role with the company for an 18-year-old man named Guy Bailey, who I spoke about earlier. Now, this interview was accepted and Bailey arrived at the offices of the company and stated that his interview had been arranged and that he was to be expected. The receptionist supposedly called through to her manager saying, "Your 2 o'clock appointment is here and he's black." The manager shouted back, "Tell him the vacancies are full." Now, explaining the situation that his friend had called ahead in response to an advert and booked the interview, the manager responded, "There's no point in having the interview. We don't employ black people." So proof, if proof were needed, that non-whites weren't afforded equal opportunities in Britain. This fueled Stevenson's drive for change. He saw the impacts that Rosa Parks had in the US in 1955, sparking the Montgomery bus boycott, something which I'm sure you're aware of, and he organised a press release for Britain's own response to it. The following day it was announced that West Indians in Bristol would no longer be using the buses, and it must be said that there was a lot of support from the white people of Bristol who also joined the boycott. When asked to comment on the boycott, Ian Patey, the general manager of the Transport and General Workers Union, the TGWU, said that the advent of coloured crews would mean a gradual falling off of white staff. And when referring to the more multicultural attitude of London, he claimed the amount of white labour dwindles steadily on the London Underground. Here you could say that he's just expressing the fears of a lot of white working class people in Bristol. Drivers at the Bristol Omnibus Company were incredibly poorly paid and already had to rely on overtime just to make ends meet. There was a genuine fear that more competition for work would make it harder and harder to survive. But then Patey goes on to say, "You won't get a white man in London to admit it, but which of them will join a service where they may find themselves working under a coloured foreman? I understand that in London, coloured men have become arrogant and rude after they have been employed for some months. So this was clearly not a matter of competition for employment. The fear runs much deeper, and it seems to imply that the racial hierarchy, which had been propagated for centuries in the UK, was something that was so deep-rooted that any attempt to destabilise it would be strongly resisted. It was also said by the TGWU that if one black man stepped on the platform as a conductor, every wheel will stop. Former cricketer Leary Constantine, who was at the time High Commissioner for Trinidad and Tobago, spoke out against the bus company when he attended a cricket match between the West Indies and Gloucester at the county ground in Bristol. But the West Indies team themselves were urged not to publicly support the boycott or offer any comment on the issue on the grounds that sport and politics do not mix. Now, this is a statement that I feel like I've heard a million times, even with regards to the global affairs of the modern day. So it's quite unsurprising that this was the line that they ran with at the time. Lasting for a few months, the Bristol Bus Boycott culminated on the 27th of August 1963, with a meeting of 500 bus workers from the company ultimately agreeing to end the colour bar policy and to now accept black employees into the company. The following day, Ian Patey publicly announced that there would be no more discrimination in their hiring process. This incidentally was the same day that Martin Luther King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington, so a momentous day both in the history of America and over here in the UK. Perhaps the efforts of Stevenson may have been overshadowed by those events in Washington, but nevertheless this was seen as a pivotal moment for race relations in the UK. It drew national attention, gaining the support of politicians, church groups and many ordinary people across the country. Later that year, the Race Relations Act of 1965 was passed, which made racial discrimination unlawful in public places. This was the first of many Race Relations Acts to be passed in the UK, but it meant that for the first time discrimination on the grounds of colour, race or ethnic or national origins was now illegal. And it gave rise to the formation of the Race Relations Board, which was basically in place to make sure the new discrimination laws were being upheld. Of course, there were many opponents to this law, claiming that it would only exacerbate racial tensions, but there were also many claiming that it didn't go far enough. Despite the impact that the Bristol Bus Boycott had on the UK, it wasn't until 1968, when the Race Relations Act was amended, that minorities in the UK would be placed on equal footing when seeking housing or employment. It goes without saying that it took the work of many people to achieve this change in British law, but Paul Stephenson, with his eloquence, intelligence and organisation, was a key figure in bringing about a change of attitude and was perhaps the cornerstone of a unified spirit that would change the tide in gaining opportunities for black people. It was said that few doubt that without Mr. Stephenson's efforts, it would have been difficult for Harold Wilson's Labour government to bring in Britain's first anti-discrimination laws. In 2009, Paul Stephenson was awarded an OBE for the part he played in organising the boycott, with Guy Bailey and Roy Hackett also receiving honours. In 2020, a statue of colonialist Edward Colston was famously torn down from Bristol city centre, and campaigners were quick to start a petition to replace the statue with one honouring Paul Stephenson. Colston had been a major figure in the slave trade and created the wealth in Bristol that ultimately saw it become a major city. But of course, how that wealth came about is something that I and many others believe should be remembered but not honoured. And of course, the point of a statue is to honour and pay respect to great figures. Replacing his statue with one of Paul Stephenson would represent an acknowledgement of a man who helped move Bristol beyond its colonial roots into a world where respect is afforded to all, regardless of the colour of somebody's skin. So that was Paul Stephenson and the Bristol Bus Boycott. If you want to learn more, I have, as always, included all the sources I used to make this video in the description, or Google is always at your fingertips. Don't forget to check out my other videos on this channel and hit subscribe. I'm loving making these videos for you, and I'd just love to be able to reach as big an audience as possible. So please keep sharing, keep liking, all that good stuff. It really does help me out massively. And I'll see you on the next one.